Between 1941 and 1945, the United States and Britain shipped over 12,000 tanks to the Soviet Union. Shermans, Valentines, Matildas, Churchills, entire fleets of armored vehicles sent across the world to help Stalin defeat Hitler. The Soviets used them. They fought with them. Thousands of Western tanks rolled across the Eastern Front, flying the Red Star. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. When the war ended, America wanted those tanks back. It was called Lend-Lease for a reason. The equipment was supposed to be returned. So what happened? Did the Soviets give them back? Did they keep them? Did they destroy them? The answer involves secret deals, Cold War tensions, and a shocking decision that left thousands of tanks at the bottom of the ocean. This is the untold story of what really happened to Soviet Lend-Lease tanks. June 22, 1941. Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers pour across the Soviet border, and the Red Army is being annihilated. In the first 6 months alone, the Soviets lost over 20,000 tanks. 20,000. The Germans were capturing and destroying Soviet armor faster than factories could replace it. T-34s and KV-1s, excellent tanks, were being lost by the hundreds every week. Stalin was desperate. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival. And despite his hatred of capitalism, Stalin needed help from the West. Enter Lend-Lease. The program had been created by President Roosevelt to help Britain survive. Now it was extended to the Soviet Union. The idea was simple. America would lend war materials to its allies. Tanks, trucks, planes, food, fuel. Everything needed to fight Hitler. The Soviets didn't have to pay up front. They just had to survive. Payment, or return of the equipment, would come later. By October 1941, the first convoys were sailing for the Soviet Union. The tanks were coming. The numbers are staggering. From America, the Soviets received over 7,000 tanks and tank destroyers. The most common was the M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the American Army. But they also got M3 Lees, M10 tank destroyers, and M24 Chaffies. From Britain, another 5,000 tanks arrived. Matilda IIs, Valentine tanks, Churchill heavy tanks. These British designs were sent directly from factories in England, shipped through the deadly Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Canada contributed too. Canadian-built Valentines made up a significant portion of the British shipments. In total, over 12,000 Western tanks reached the Soviet Union during the war. Now, the Soviets had complicated feelings about these tanks. Soviet propaganda downplayed Lend-Lease for decades. They claimed Western tanks were inferior. They called the M3 Lee a coffin for 7 brothers because of its high profile and thin armor. But the reality was different. Soviet tank crews often preferred the Sherman for its reliability and comfort. The Valentine was praised for its durability in Russian conditions. And regardless of quality, these tanks filled critical gaps when Soviet production couldn't keep up. At certain points in 1942 and 1943, Lend-Lease tanks made up 15 to 20% of Soviet armored strength. That's not nothing. That's potentially war-changing. Getting these tanks to Russia was almost as dangerous as using them in combat. There were 3 main routes. The Arctic convoys were the most famous and the most deadly. Ships loaded with tanks and supplies sailed from Britain and Iceland around Nazi-occupied Norway to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. German submarines, aircraft, and surface ships hunted these convoys relentlessly. Convoy PQ-17 became the most notorious disaster. In July 1942, the convoy was ordered to scatter when intelligence suggested German battleships were approaching. Left without protection, the merchant ships were slaughtered. 24 of 35 ships were sunk. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of supplies, lost to the freezing Arctic waters. The men who survived the sinkings often died within minutes in the cold. Water temperature was below freezing. You had maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia killed you. The second route went through Persia, modern-day Iran. Ships carried tanks to Iranian ports, then trucks and trains moved them north through Iran into Soviet territory. Longer but safer. The third route crossed the Pacific to Vladivostok. Japanese forces could have intercepted these convoys, but Japan and the Soviet Union maintained a neutrality pact until 1945. So American tanks sailed past Japanese-controlled waters to reach Russia's eastern ports, then traveled thousands of miles by rail to the front. Each tank that reached a Soviet crew had survived an incredible journey. Once they arrived, Lend-Lease tanks were distributed throughout the Red Army. Soviet crews had to adapt quickly. The controls were different. The Sherman's transmission was unfamiliar. The radio equipment used different frequencies. Even the fuel requirements differed from Soviet tanks. But they made it work. Lend-Lease tanks fought in nearly every major battle of the Eastern Front from 1942 onward. Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration, the drive to Berlin. The Valentine tank was particularly popular in Soviet service. It was reliable, easy to maintain, and had a low profile that made it hard to hit. Soviet commanders often assigned Valentines to reconnaissance units, where their reliability mattered more than heavy armor. The Sherman, called MSHA by Soviet crews from the Russian pronunciation of M4, was respected for its comfort and mechanical reliability. Soviet tankers noted that Shermans broke down far less often than their own T-34s, which surprised American engineers who thought the T-34 was mechanically superior. But there were complaints too. American tanks ran on gasoline, which burned more easily than the diesel used in Soviet tanks. One hit and the Sherman could turn into an inferno. Soviet crews called it the lighter. Still, when your choice is a foreign tank or no tank at all, you take what you can get. By war's end, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers had fought and died in Lend-Lease tanks. These machines were instruments of victory, no matter what Soviet propaganda later claimed. May 1945. The war in Europe is over, Nazi Germany is defeated, and now America wanted to settle accounts. Lend-Lease had always been structured as a loan, not a gift. The equipment was supposed to be returned, or paid for, when the war ended. America began calculating what the Soviets owed. The total Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union was valued at approximately $11 billion. In 1945 dollars, adjusted for inflation, that's well over $150 billion today. America didn't expect full repayment. Much of the equipment had been destroyed in combat. You can't return a tank that's a burned-out wreck on a Ukrainian battlefield. But surviving equipment, America wanted it back, or at least wanted compensation. The Soviets refused. Stalin had no intention of returning anything, or paying for it. The Cold War was already beginning. The alliance of convenience against Hitler was dissolving into suspicion and hostility. Soviet negotiators argued that the USSR had paid for Lend-Lease in blood. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. Compared to that sacrifice, what was some American equipment? American negotiators pointed out that a deal was a deal. Lend-Lease was literally a lease. The word was right there in the name. Negotiations dragged on for years, then decades. The Soviets never returned the tanks. They barely acknowledged the debt existed. Here's where the story gets truly strange. The Lend-Lease agreement had a clause for equipment that wasn't returned. If the Soviets didn't want to return the tanks, and America didn't want them falling into Soviet hands for study and reverse engineering, there was a third option: destruction. And that's exactly what happened to thousands of Lend-Lease vehicles. Rather than hand back operational tanks, rather than argue about payments, both sides agreed to simply destroy surviving equipment. American inspectors sometimes oversaw the process. Tanks were driven to remote areas, stripped of useful components, and then crushed, burned, or buried. Some were pushed into the sea. Entire shiploads of Lend-Lease equipment were dumped into the ocean, rather than become a point of Cold War tension. Off the coast of Murmansk, in the Kola Bay, Lend-Lease vehicles were loaded onto ships and deliberately sunk. To this day, divers occasionally find Sherman tanks and other American vehicles resting on the seafloor in Russian waters. Not battle wrecks, not ships lost to German torpedoes. Perfectly good tanks, deliberately drowned because two superpowers couldn't agree on the bill. It was cheaper to destroy them than to argue about them. The Lend-Lease debt became one of the longest-running financial disputes in history. For decades, the Soviet Union simply refused to discuss it seriously. Every few years, American diplomats would raise the issue. Soviet diplomats would brush it aside. The Cold War made any resolution impossible. Only after the Soviet Union collapsed did things finally change. In 1972, the USSR had agreed in principle to pay $722 million, a fraction of the original debt, spread over 30 years. They made a few payments, then stopped during renewed Cold War tensions. After 1991, the new Russian Federation inherited the debt. In 2006, Russia finally completed the last payment, 61 years after the war ended. Over half a century to settle the bill for tanks that had long since rusted to nothing or been deliberately sunk. Those 12,000 tanks helped save the Soviet Union. They helped defeat Nazi Germany, and then they became a Cold War embarrassment. Destroyed or forgotten, their contribution to victory erased from Soviet history books. Until now.